Hello, welcome to Brain Science. In this episode of Brain Science, I want to review a behavioral disorder called anorexia nervosa. New information has come out about anorexia nervosa recently. It's important for an understanding of this disorder. So let's begin. What exactly is anorexia nervosa and what might cause it? Well, one of the most important features of anorexia nervosa is a desire to lose body weight. And to do this, people with anorexia starve themselves and reduce their food intake to very limited amounts so that they acquire very low body weight. Now, this kind of activity is not exactly uncommon in the United States. Lots of people want to lose weight, and lots of people throughout the country go on diets every year in an attempt to reduce their body fat. And many of them are relatively successful at this, but most people only manage to reduce their body weight by a modest amount, and some people put the weight right back on again. Anorexics, on the other hand, can produce sustained losses in body weight that can be very extreme and can lead to severe emaciation and even death. So people with anorexia nervosa have an ability to do something that most of us can't do. What causes this ability? And what are the special features of anorexia nervosa? One of the things that's very unusual about anorexia nervosa is that most of the people with anorexia are women. Something like 90% of anorexics are women, and the behavioral disorder starts usually at or around the time of puberty. So this is a very special feature of anorexics. Now, what other special features of anorexics allow them to accomplish this severe decrease in body weight? Well, we think that there's a good indication that genetics may play a role. There's evidence for a strong genetic contribution to the symptoms of anorexia nervosa. How do we know this? One of the ways to know this is by studying the life and patterns of body weight of identical twins. It turns out that if you follow identical twin girls for a long period of time, if one of the twin girls develops anorexia nervosa, her twin sister is relatively likely to also get it. On the other hand, if you examine the lifestyles of ordinary sisters or fraternal twin sisters, if one sister gets anorexia nervosa, the other sister is fairly unlikely to ever develop it. So that people with identical DNA are much more likely to both get anorexia than would ordinarily be expected. This suggests that there's a strong genetic contribution to the disorder. How could a genetic mutation contribute to the symptoms of anorexia nervosa? What genes are involved and what proteins could be related to this disorder? The genetics of anorexia nervosa have been studied intensively for about 20 years, ever since these twin studies became apparent. And it's been difficult to find a specific gene or a specific protein that the gene codes for that may relate to anorexia. Partly this is because you need to acquire large numbers of patients to do a statistically significant genetic study. And it's difficult to find large numbers of people with anorexia nervosa because it's relatively uncommon. Also, there's a suspicion that more than one gene may contribute to this disease, which really complicates analysis of the disorder. However, in the last 5 years or so, genes for at least 2 different proteins have been identified that may be related to anorexia nervosa. What are these proteins? One of the proteins that might be involved in anorexia is called estrogen-related receptor protein. This information was recently discovered by the team of Hujing Cui and Michael Lutter and co-workers, and they reported that this protein may be involved in anorexia. More recently, another protein has also been identified, which is called soluble epoxide hydrolase. And this particular protein also seems to be abnormal in anorexics. And the role of this protein in anorexia has been discussed by Betty Shi in California in this publication. Now, what in the world are these particular proteins, and how could they possibly contribute to the symptoms of anorexia? Let's look at each one of them slowly. What is an estrogen receptor? An estrogen receptor is a long strand of protein that's found in the nucleus of a cell. It reacts to a hormone called estrogen. What is estrogen? Estrogen is a molecule derived from cholesterol, and it belongs to a family of hormones called steroid hormones that are secreted by the sex organs of the body. Female sex organs, called ovaries, are the ones that secrete estrogen. And when estrogen is secreted into the body, it goes into the bloodstream and travels to cells where it affects the function of cells. To do this, the estrogen molecule has to pass the cell membrane and enter the cell nucleus. And when it does enter the cell nucleus, it binds to the steroid receptor protein called estrogen receptors. And when it binds to the receptors, it changes the shape of the receptor protein, and that allows the receptor protein to bind to DNA. When it binds to the DNA of chromosomes, this activated estrogen receptor changes the function of lots of parts of the DNA, and therefore it changes the function of cells. Well, why do we care? It turns out that this newly discovered protein called an estrogen receptor-related protein seems to be involved in anorexia. This EERP protein does not actually bind estrogen, but is similar in its structure to the estrogen receptor. More recently, a group of people, including T. Tanida in 2015, found that this EERP protein interacts with the estrogen receptor. When it's present in the nucleus, the EERP protein seems to block the ability of the estrogen receptor to bind to DNA. So this would normally make cells insensitive to estrogen. If you have an abnormal ERR protein, this would not function properly, and therefore it would make cells hypersensitive to estrogen. So this is of great interest to us because it's possible that estrogen has a role to play in anorexia nervosa. Why do we think this? It turns out that if you inject animals or humans with estrogen, they have a potent ability to decrease food intake and body weight. Here you can see a diagram of the food intake of a rat before and after it was given estrogen. Several days after an injection of estradiol benzoate, or EB in this picture, you can see the food intake falls by between 20 and 30%. Curiously, the rats that are fed a high-fat diet seem to be more responsive to estrogen than normal, and no one really knows exactly why this is. At any rate, you can see that estrogen has a potent anorexic effect in rats and in humans as well. If that's the case, perhaps a hypersensitivity to estrogen of brain cells may result in reduced feeding behavior and may contribute to anorexia. This general theme has been followed by a number of researchers, including Kelly Klump, who's published a number of papers showing that perhaps an abnormality in the steroid exposure of the brain during development may result in anorexia. And also, I've published a review of this on a number of occasions suggesting this might be the case. Do we have any concrete evidence suggesting that this possibility may be true? Let's find out. There is evidence from a syndrome called Turner syndrome that estrogen may on occasion have exaggerated effects upon food intake and body weight. What is Turner syndrome? Turner syndrome occurs when the cells of the body lose one of the chromosomes, and therefore instead of having two XX sex chromosomes, the cells of the body only have one X chromosome. This results in a number of different symptoms. And one of the symptoms of Turner syndrome is that the person involved can no longer generate ovaries during embryogenesis, and therefore a person will grow up lacking any ovaries. This, of course, results in a lack of pubertal development because they don't have any sex steroids which are normally produced by the ovaries. To try to treat these patients, a number of physicians on occasion have given estrogens. Turner syndrome patients may be treated with ethinyl estradiol to induce the secondary signs of puberty and try to allow these people to have a normal adolescence. Now, in about 20 to 30 cases reported in the literature, this treatment may be associated with an onset of anorexia nervosa, and the anorexia nervosa disappears if the estrogen treatment is removed. Here's one of the papers showing this effect of estrogen. In this graph, you can see the gradual increase in body weight over the life of an individual. And between 7 and 10 years of age, the body weight is a little subnormal. But when this individual was given estrogen at about 13 years of age, suddenly there was a marked decrease in body weight, as well as a marked decrease in food intake. So in this instance, the administration of estrogen causes an exaggerated effect on food intake and causes the symptoms of true anorexia nervosa. So this has been reported in a number of cases of Turner syndrome. Now, why do these Turner's patients respond to estrogen so severely? We don't know if they have abnormal ERRP proteins or not. One of the curious things about people with Turner syndrome is that they tend to have very low levels of thyroxine, another hormone produced by the thyroid gland. Now, curiously, thyroxine has the ability to interfere with the anorexic effects of estrogen. So if thyroxine is not present in the body, one would expect that such a person would be hyper-responsive to estrogen, and this might explain the lowered food intake in people with Turner syndrome. All these types of data suggest that an abnormal response to estrogen could be a very important part of anorexia nervosa. And what about the other protein that's been determined to be abnormal in anorexia, the soluble epoxide hydrolase protein? Well, this is a long name for a protein, but basically it describes an enzyme that regulates the metabolism of fatty acids and other oily substances in the body. We don't know exactly how this particular protein may result in the symptoms of anorexia. This is still being studied. However, in mice, abnormalities in this protein, SEH, can affect the production of sex hormones like testosterone, which is another steroid hormone present in the body. So perhaps an abnormality in this enzyme could result in abnormalities in the production of sex hormones, and like the other protein, could result in an abnormal effect of estrogen on food intake. All of these things would explain why anorexics typically are female, and they typically acquire the symptoms at or around the time of puberty. If this is the case, perhaps administration of drugs that block effects of estrogen could have a positive effect on the symptoms of anorexia nervosa. If you're interested in these types of topics and are curious about what controls hunger and body weight and thirst, you might want to take a look at a book of mine that I published recently, and this describes in greater detail how the brain regulates food intake. Finally, if you want to learn more about these types of things in neuroscience, I invite you to subscribe to my channel, and there's some additional videos on other neurological conditions that might be interesting to you. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching.